Hey all, today we are going to talk about deductive reasoning. And so in deductive reasoning we have three laws that we talk about. The first one being called the law of detachment. So in each of the laws we're given some information and then we can either draw a conclusion or we can't. And so in this first law we have a conditional statement. Some if P then Q, just like in the conditional statements lesson. And then along with that, we'll give some regular statement that is an example of P, the hypothesis. And so if we have those two things, we can draw this conclusion, and the conclusion we can draw is about Q, the conclusion of the original conditional statement. So that's a lot easier to make sense out of if we look at an example. So here I'm going to use green to highlight P, and I'm going to use pink to highlight Q. P is it rains. Q is football will not practice. So that's our if-then. That's our PQ. And then let's look at this next statement. It rains on Wednesday. The hypothesis was about it raining. And this is an example of it raining on Wednesday. So we have the conditional statement, if P then Q, and we have an example of P, and so the conclusion we can draw is about the purple part, or the pink part, that football will not practice, and so we can say football will not practice, and then we'll add Wednesday on there, since that's what this statement was talking about. So let me show you another example. Here I say, if you do your homework, so you do your homework is P, then you will get an A. You get an A is Q. Bob did his homework. That's in relationship to the hypothesis, P, so green. So here we have if P then Q, and then we have an example of P, Bob doing his homework. So we can say that Bob's going to get an A. So I also want to show you what it looks like when this doesn't work, because sometimes you can't make a conclusion. So here I have it rains and football will not practice, same as before. And so this example is football is not practicing on Saturday. So that's related to Q, the pink or purple one. Okay, that's not having to do with the law of detachment. The law of detachment says if P then Q, and we have an example of P, then we can make a conclusion. In this case, we cannot make a conclusion. So I want you to pause here. I want you to try these two. This one you can make a conclusion, and this one you cannot, and I just want you to figure out why. So in this one, we can draw a conclusion because, or the conclusion we can draw is that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent, because we have an if-then statement, and then we have an example of the hypothesis, so we can draw a conclusion about Q, the conclusion. This one we can't draw a conclusion because even though we have an if-then, our second statement, this about them being congruent, relates to the conclusion Q, and that doesn't follow the law of detachment. So we have to follow the law, and so we can't draw any conclusions. The next law is called the law of syllogism. In this law, we get two conditional statements. We get an if P, I'll try to be consistent, green, if P then Q, and then if Q then R. We add this new letter R. And if we have two conditional statements, one that ends the exact same way the other one starts, then we can just sort of get rid of this pink-purple part and have a new statement, if P, then R. So we take these two conditional statements and sort of put them together to form a new one. So let me show you a couple examples. Here we have it rains being P, football will not practice. And here again we see if football does not practice, so that's Q again. And the team will lift weights, that's R. So we can sort of get rid of all this purple stuff and combine the green with the blue, keeping if and then, and get if it rains, then the team will lift weights. Same idea here. We're back to Bob. You do your homework. You get an A. If you get an A, Mr. Pickard will be happy. So because we ended this statement up here, number one statement, the same way we started the second statement, we sort of get rid of the purple part, and we create this statement, if you do your homework, then Mr. Pickard will be happy. So sometimes it looks like it's going to work, but it won't, and here's an example of that. We have that if it rains, football will not practice. And then again, we start with if it rains. So we're starting the same way. That doesn't follow the law of syllogism. Then the field will be wet. So we have to end one statement the way we start the next one. In this one, we start with P both times. So we have if P then Q, if P then R. And so we can't make any conclusions because it doesn't follow the law. So pause this one again, and I want you to try and answer what conclusion can you draw here, and why can't you draw the conclusion here. So in this one, we can draw a conclusion. If a ray is a bisector, then the smaller angles are congruent, and that is because we end this statement the same way we start this one. And here we can't draw a conclusion because the end of one conditional is not the same as the beginning of the other one. So it does not follow the law. We don't have if P then Q, if Q then R. So we have one more law, and it's similar to the law of detachment. It's called the law of contrapositive. That should sound familiar to you from conditional statements. We start again with a if P then Q. And this time we're given an example of not Q, so the opposite meaning of Q. That's what that squiggly means, remember. And if we get if P then Q and this example of the opposite of Q being true, then we can conclude the opposite of P being true, so not P. So let me give you an example of that like I have the other ones. Again, we have it raining, and football not practicing, although we know they'd still practice. And then we have this example, football practice Wednesday. Okay, Q was about football not practicing. This one says football does practice. That's the opposite. That's not Q. And so our conclusion is going to be the opposite of it raining, and so we conclude it did not rain Wednesday. Back to Bob doing his homework. You do your homework as P. You get an A as Q. So we have Bob getting a C. That's an example of not getting an A. So it's the opposite meaning. Q was you get an A. This says Bob gets a C. That's not getting an A. And so we can conclude not P, or that Bob did not do his homework. So just like the other ones, we have to follow the law just the way it's written. So if it's written in a different way, we can't draw any conclusions. So if we have it raining and football not practicing, and then our example is it's not raining Wednesday, well, that's an example of not P. And that doesn't follow the law. In order to follow the law and make a conclusion, we need an example of not Q. And so since we have a not P, the opposite of it raining, then we can't make any conclusions here. So just like on the last two, I want you to pause, and I want you to see if you can draw conclusions. And I am noticing right now that I never changed these questions, so you are free from having to try these again. It's your lucky day, and we'll practice the law of contrapositive a little more in class. So there will be a couple questions here, though, that I want you to answer. Make sure you answer those. And if you have any questions, make sure you write them down so you can ask me in class.